The most dangerous villain in epic fantasy isn't the one who wants to conquer the world. It's the one who can tell you, in precise and deeply uncomfortable detail, exactly why the world deserves to be conquered. And here's what actually bothers me. Fantasy literature has been producing this villain for decades, and almost every single author who creates one flinches at the last possible moment. Let's call this archetype what it actually is. Not a villain in the traditional sense, not quite an anti-hero either. What we're dealing with is what philosophers would call a radical critic, someone whose diagnosis of a broken system is not only coherent, but often more rigorously argued than anything the protagonist offers in return. This character has haunted literature for centuries, but epic fantasy has become its natural home. Go back to John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1667. Satan's opening arguments in hell are devastatingly logical. He looks at heaven's hierarchy, identifies it as arbitrary power dressed up as divine order, and asks a genuinely fair question. Why should obedience be a virtue when the authority demanding it has never justified itself? Milton intended Satan as a cautionary figure, but generations of readers, including the poet William Blake, decided Satan was the real hero. That response tells you something important. We live in a moment where trust in institutions is at historic lows. People across the political spectrum look at the systems surrounding them, economic, political, social, and feel exactly what the coherent fantasy villain always articulates. This is broken, the people running it know it, and they are not going to fix it from the inside. That is not a fringe position anymore. It is a defining mood of our era, which is exactly why this literary conversation feels urgent right now. Here is the formula we encounter in most epic fantasy. 3 books, sometimes more, spent building a world we learn to love. The magic system, the cultures, the friendships, the hard-won victories, and then somewhere near the end, the primary antagonist delivers what I have started calling the diagnosis speech. They lay out the poverty, the corruption, the structural violence baked into the world we have been cheering for. And they are not wrong. The author built that world. They made it broken on purpose. So the author has a problem. They have created a villain whose argument the reader cannot cleanly refute. And the most common solution, what I think of as the first escape hatch, is escalating the body count until the ideology disappears beneath the weight of atrocity. The villain starts bombing cities, mass executions, children. By the time we process the horror, we have forgotten the speech about corruption and institutional rot because we are too busy being appalled. The original critique gets buried. That is the point. The second escape hatch is the tragic backstory reveal. The villain watched their village burn. They lost someone they loved. The narrative then performs a subtle sleight of hand. It reframes their entire ideology as grief in disguise. What looked like a reasoned political argument gets quietly reclassified as trauma response. And listen, trauma absolutely shapes political belief. But when backstory becomes the explanation rather than the context, the author is telling us, don't engage with what they said, just feel sorry for them. The third escape hatch might be the most frustrating of all. The hero wins, the villain is defeated. And then in the final pages, the protagonist promises vaguely, warmly, without any structural plan whatsoever to fix things. The inequality the villain diagnosed, the corruption, the suffering. Our hero gestures at all of it sincerely, and the narrative treats that gesture as genuine resolution. The reader is supposed to find it satisfying. I find it evasive. What all 3 escape hatches share is that they let the author dodge the hardest question their own story raised. Not whether the villain was wrong about the diagnosis, they were not. Not even whether the villain was wrong that the system will not reform itself. Frequently, they are right about that too. The real question is, can you argue, rigorously and honestly, that their solution was wrong, not that it was brutal? Actually wrong. That requires political philosophy, not just skillful plotting. The closest I have seen to a genuine engagement with this problem is Seth Dickinson's The Traitor Baru Cormorant. What Dickinson does that almost no other fantasy writer attempts is refuse to clean up the moral ledger at the end. Baru's enemies are architects of a genuinely genocidal colonial empire. Their system destroys cultures and lives in concrete, documented ways. And the novel will not let dismantling that empire feel cost-free or righteous. The violence of tearing a broken system down is not presented as categorically different from the violence that built it. What Dickinson is willing to do, and what most fantasy authors simply are not, is treat his world's politics as a real problem with no clean answer. Not a puzzle the right hero with the right heart can solve if they care enough. An actual dilemma, where every path forward costs something real and irreversible, and where the villain's diagnosis and the hero's response can both be true and both be insufficient at the same time. That demands the author have done serious political thinking, not just borrowed the imagery of revolution. Ursula Le Guin spent her entire career arguing that speculative fiction had a moral obligation to take its politics seriously. In The Dispossessed, she builds two worlds, an anarchist moon colony and a capitalist planet, and refuses to let either one be the clear answer. Her protagonist does not win by choosing the correct side. He wins by learning to hold the contradiction without resolving it. She called it the ambiguous utopia. Fantasy keeps borrowing that aesthetic label without doing the underlying philosophical work. Here is a connection that might reframe everything. The tension we keep running into in fantasy fiction mirrors one of the oldest debates in political philosophy: Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine. Burke argued that existing institutions, however flawed, encode generations of accumulated practical wisdom, and that radical destruction loses more than it gains. Paine argued that institutions built on injustice have no legitimate claim to preservation. Both arguments are coherent, neither fully defeats the other. The fantasy villain is almost always making the Paine argument. The hero wins by making the Burke argument without ever quite realizing it. You see the same unresolved tension in contemporary pop culture. Killmonger in Black Panther is the most widely discussed recent example. A character whose diagnosis of global anti-Black violence and Western complicity is accurate, whose rage is entirely comprehensible, and whom the narrative still has to defeat because his method is indistinguishable from the system he is fighting. The film knows it cannot fully refute him. T'Challa makes a speech about not becoming the enemy, and the film hopes that lands. It mostly does, but Killmonger's argument does not dissolve. It just sits there in the room. And readers feel that unresolved weight in their bones. The coherent villain tends to be the character people cannot stop thinking about. They write the long essays. They fill the comment sections years later. They return to the diagnosis speech long after they have forgotten the hero's triumphant final moment. That is not a coincidence. These characters touch something real, the genuine discomfort of living inside systems that are functional and broken simultaneously, worth preserving and worth interrogating at the same time. The villain gives language to that discomfort. The hero rarely gives us anything adequate in response. Here is something I bet you did not know. The most celebrated literary villain of the 20th century, O'Brien in George Orwell's 1984, was specifically engineered to have no coherent argument whatsoever. Orwell made that choice deliberately. He wanted a villain whose ideology was pure will to power, stripped entirely of idealism and rational justification. In his working notes, he describes this as the honest face of totalitarianism. He was explicitly refusing to grant the villain a cogent case, because he believed coherent villains were, in a subtle way, a form of flattery toward authoritarianism. Which is a genuinely fascinating counterargument. Orwell's position would be, granting a villain a coherent worldview aesthetizes political evil, makes it legible, intellectually interesting, almost seductive. But here is where I push back. A villain whose argument collapses under scrutiny gives readers false comfort. It implies that broken systems are maintained by cartoonishly bad people, rather than by structural incentives that ordinary, reasonable people have perfectly sensible-sounding justifications for sustaining. The coherent villain is uncomfortable precisely because it reflects something truer about how injustice actually perpetuates itself. The rarest version of this, the one almost never written, is the story where the coherent villain is right about the diagnosis, right that the existing power structure will not self-correct, and the narrative still builds a serious, non-sentimental argument for why their particular solution fails. Not because they escalated into atrocity we can safely deplore. Not because a backstory explains their reasoning away as grief, but because an actual alternative path is constructed and genuinely defended on the page. I have seen this attempted. I have almost never seen it completed. So what does all of this actually tell us? I think the coherent villain problem is a test of whether an author genuinely trusts their own world. A fantasy novel that builds a serious diagnosis and then escapes through atrocity, tragic backstory, or vague heroic promise is a novel that does not believe it can defend the order it is asking us to root for. It hopes we will be distracted by the stakes, moved by the relationships, satisfied by the resolution. We often are, the best readers are not. The books that handle this well, truly, honestly well, are not escapes from political reality. They are invitations into it. They ask us to sit with the discomfort that the villain identified something real, that the hero's victory did not resolve it, that we live in a world full of coherent villains and imperfect heroes and systems that nobody designed for justice, and that nobody quite knows how to fix. That is not a comfortable place to end a story, but it might be the most honest place literature can take us. If this changed how you think about the moral architecture of fantasy fiction, we have an episode on Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness that goes even deeper, into how she used an entirely alien world to ask questions about gender, power, and belonging that no contemporary novel could approach directly without deflection. Same channel. Same kind of slightly uncomfortable close reading. We will see you there.